1999, a young student just completing his PhD at Columbia University in the United States of America published a book called The Accuracy of Voluntary Movement, what is widely considered to be the first book in the field of motor control and learning. This student was Robert S. Woodworth, and little did he know that this publishing would kickstart what is essentially an entirely new branch of movement science. Nearly 50 to 60 years after him publishing that book, the field encountered a major boom, with many prominent researchers and studies coming to prominence. By the 90s, the field already had two well-established theories of skill acquisition, essentially theories of how we acquire new skills. But we're moving ahead too fast. What even is motor learning? Broadly speaking, motor learning is a relatively permanent change in our ability to perform a task due to practice.
You might think of this as improving your skills in practicing boxing over many years, or playing an instrument. Motor learning is something we all experience over the duration of our lives, from infancy to adulthood, in our professional lives and our personal ones.
This is exactly the reason so many people and institutions don't really see the value in implementing these new principles of practice. After all, if your method of practice already works to some extent, why would you really need to change it?
Hey,
Hi.
Hello, I'm here with Osama. Yo, how you doing?
Yo, how you doing? How you doing? I think
so first off, just based off of the name, what do you think motor learning is?
The accumulation of a new skill through practice, repeated practice.
I guess just on top of my head, motor learning has to do with doing something over and over again until you learn
Yeah.
what it is.
Yeah.
So I feel like it's about like learning how to walk.
Based off of that definition, do you think this whole branch of motor learning is going to be significantly useful to you in your personal life?
Honestly, not really, because
Yeah.
unless I'm a varsity athlete, like in my life, I've
Mhm.
pretty much learned what I need to do without motor learning.
This is the answer I got most of the time, where essentially people were familiar enough with the process of practice and they had had enough success with it in the past that they didn't really consider changing their routines just for a relatively obscure branch of science. To illustrate this, I asked the participants their opinions on a popular study conducted in 1996 in the University of Chicago by Dr. Blaslato. He had three different groups of participants. He measured each group's free throw percentage at the beginning of the study and again 3 months later. For the first group, he instructed them to practice 1 hour a day for 3 months. The second group was asked to visualize that they were shooting a free throw for an hour a day, and the third didn't practice at all. Now, what do you think happened?
I think the first group improved the most because they had hands-on experience with doing free.
I would imagine that the group that just did normal free throws probably did the best, since they're practicing the skill that they want to learn.
Now, what would you think if I told you that the first group got a 24% increase in their free throw percentage, and the second group actually got a 23% increase in their free throw percentage?
Wow.
Yeah.
And this is what we see time and time again in the field of motor learning, where essentially people don't realize how much they don't know about something as simple as practice and how much more value they can add into their lives by implementing these principles that we learn from the field of motor control and learning. This can be best explained by looking at Fitt's model of skill acquisition. And in this model, there's three main stages: the cognitive stage, the associative stage, and the autonomous stage. The cognitive stage is pretty much ground zero for learning a new skill. You have a low level of familiarity with the task, and you're essentially just trying to understand what you're trying to accomplish and how to accomplish it. You're still very unsure of your mistakes and how to fix them. The second stage is the associative stage. Here, you're already decently associated with the movements, and you're essentially trying to refine your movement patterns and sequences. What's so clearly observable at this stage is that your movements become much more consistent, and you're already aware of your mistakes and essentially know more or less how to correct them. Your awareness of the context surrounding your decisions also improves, and you start making different decisions based on the context. In the last stage, the autonomous stage, you're seeking complete control and perfection of the movements and sequences. You're aware of very small mistakes and know exactly how to correct them. You're also almost completely aware of the context surrounding your task. And so, using this model, we can understand that the active visualization of going through the motions of a free throw enhances the associative stage the most, or essentially, participants were improving their consistency and refining their movements in movement sequences. That is essentially why, without even touching a basketball, participants were able to improve their free throw percentage by up to 23% over the course of 3 months. And this one study is not just an isolated incident. We see this time and time again in motor learning, where these new landmark studies can often seem counterintuitive at first. In the study, there were 4 groups of participants, and all of them shot free throws at the beginning of the study to record their percentage, and again 3 weeks later, after practicing 4 days a week for 3 weeks. The first group just practiced shots from the free throw line, but the last 3 practiced shots from anywhere within 2 feet of the free throw line. So the second group practiced 2 feet to the sides of the foul line. The third had to do 2 feet in front of and behind the foul line, and the last group did 2 feet in front of and behind the foul line, as well as on the foul line. Now, what do you think, Cap?
I would imagine that the group that just did normal free throws probably did the best.
It's the first group. First group would do better because
Yeah.
they have practice from the free throw line.
What they found was the second group, the one that shot 2 feet in front of and 2 feet behind the free throw line, actually recorded something close to a 10 times increase in skill relative to the first group. So it's almost a 10 times difference. And again, this can be explained through the use of some motor learning principles, where the idea here is constant versus variable practice. And where most people would expect constant practice to be more effective, variable learning actually provides something that the constant condition can't: a schema. A schema is essentially the mental representation we have of doing something, for example, shooting a basketball. And so when participants undertook variable practice, they essentially learned how different actions in shooting a basketball can have different consequences, such as when you're shooting when you're farther away from the net or at an angle to the net. Constant variable essentially didn't allow participants to develop the schema, and so they were oddly less aware of how different movements would affect their task performance, unlike the variable group. In motor learning, however, the type of practice involved is just one piece of the puzzle in how we can use practice for our benefit. Something that's entirely different but just as important is how we structure our practice sessions. So there are many variations on how to structure practice sessions, and one way to do it is by massed or blocked practice against distributed or random practice. So blocked practice essentially makes you do all of the trials of a specific task one after another, while random practice makes you do a bit of the task, then a bit of another task, and then back to the main task, and so on and so on. In the study, there were 2 groups of participants, and what they had to do was chip the ball as close to the target as possible in a game of golf. And they did this from 3 different surfaces. One was a completely flat surface, the next was 8-degree incline, and the third was an 8-degree decline. And so trials were separated into 9 blocks of 6 trials each. And the first group had to do 6 trials on one surface, and then 6 trials on the next surface, and so on. But the second group had to do 2 trials on one surface, then move on to the next 2 trials on a different surface, and then 2 trials on a third surface, and so on until all the trials were completed. Afterwards, they measured the retention, doing a retention test 5 minutes after the trials had concluded. They also measured their accuracy throughout the test. Now, what do you think happened? Did better on the retention test.
The group that did 9 shots and then took a break, those guys had the better retention.
That's actually close, but it's super unexpected because the second group had the better one. So why does random practice produce so much better retention results than constant practice? Well, the main theory is that with constant practice, participants can essentially come up with short-term solutions to their problems and then just keep repeating them. Whereas with the random practice condition, participants are essentially forced to come up with new action plans every time they switch conditions. So ultimately, that made participants in the random condition much better at recalling their action plans. So now that we've talked about the 3 most major components of practice, the type of practice, the structuring of practice, and constant versus variable practice, we come back to the central question of this video. Why exactly are these findings so counterintuitive? There's essentially 3 reasons. The first reason is that these findings are genuinely surprising, but this effect is heightened by these following 2 reasons. The second reason is that motor learning as a whole is kind of an obscure branch of science, and so when these landmark studies are published, they don't reach the same level of fame that a psychological study, for example, would reach. And the third is that on an institutional and individual level, most people don't really see how motor learning could affect them, and so they don't really implement it. Institutions don't implement it, and individuals aren't encouraged to implement these surprising effects in their daily lives. So oddly enough, the reason these findings are so obscure may also be the one thing that we need to change most about motor control and learning, and that's its relative obscurity as a branch of science.